Dar es Salaam's 2020 Winter Intensive. Hopefully everybody had a good night's rest, had a good breakfast, and is energized and ready to go. Inshallah, today we'll be starting off with Ustadh Mobeen, and he'll be speaking on the topic of the question of gender and gender identity. Ustadh Mobeen, inshallah, whenever you're ready to start, you can go ahead.
Give me 1 second, inshallah. Pull up my slides. Bismillah. Slides are up. Share my screen. Can you see my slides okay?
Yes.
طيب. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وعلى آله وصحبه وبمن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. قال رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Inshallah, I hope everyone has had a good program and good conference. Inshallah, I believe today is the last day of the program, and I have the distinct pleasure of headlining today with a discussion on gender and gender identity. I suspect some of the material that I cover and go through will reinforce some of what people like Dr. and Sheikh Abdullah bin Hamid Ali have been covering over the past few days, and also connect in some ways to some of the discussions that I myself have had as part of the program when we talked about the modern worldview and our moral and ethical schema and commitments as a community of believers towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So without any further ado, we'll go ahead and jump into the slides. I'm going to start here by situating a couple of things and talking about some historical developments in context. And then from there, we'll talk a lot about the concepts and theories that I think underline, animate, and give shape to transgenderism and some of the transgender discourse. And then thereafter, we'll talk about what transgenderism is, as well as some of the shapes it is taking today. The sexual revolution itself is really a reference to a series of historical developments that were tightly bound in the 60s and 70s, largely in the West. The sexual revolution is defined by a rejection of Christian and really by extension Abrahamic religious moral norms surrounding gender, sex, and sexuality. So some of these moral norms, again, are slightly different or modified from Islam, but by and large, we're talking about moral norms that are shared across the Abrahamic faith traditions. One of the things that the sexual revolution does is that it creates a separation between sex, reproduction, and marriage. And so there are a couple of really pivotal and important developments that coincide with the sexual revolution. Perhaps the most significant, one of the most significant, if not the most significant, is really the introduction of the pill. And I guess I should have foregrounded this discussion by simply saying that there's some sensitive material I'll be touching on, obviously. I don't intend to speak in code, so this will be a very sort of forthright and plain discussion on the topic. For parents and families, please take note. So I understand as a parent myself, just some of those complications. So in any event, that's the disclaimer. I probably should have had it on the introductory slide. Ala kulli hal, just sort of continuing here, the birth control pill really gets introduced in the late 50s. Prior to the birth control pill, you didn't have a reliable means by which contraception could be used as part of the sexual act. Certainly, there were some rudimentary methods that people had. Even condoms were available, although again they weren't very reliable. And so, prior to really the early 60s, late 50s, from a purely sort of technological availability perspective, when people participated in sex, it always carried the potential implication of procreation, which is to say a pregnancy was always on the table when people had sex, which partly accounts for the fact that prior to the sexual revolution, out of wedlock births were actually very low statistically in number. In fact, all the way up until the early 60s, you're talking about less than 10% of all births occurring out of wedlock. Right now, we're looking at about half of all children born out of wedlock. And so the numbers begin to skyrocket during the sexual revolution, in spite of the fact that contraception, like the pill, is now available, and the pill being very effective. And so what you have is the introduction of consequence-free sex, right? It becomes a very casualized activity. It becomes something that gets redefined from something that is tethered to and bound up in questions of family and children to something that is merely pleasure bound. It is erotic, right? That's all sex is about now. With that, you have a number of other developments that take place. And some of them are quite interesting to us simply because I think some of us fail to appreciate just how conservative even Western societies were all the way up until the 60s. So in the 60s, for instance, you have a decriminalization and a legalization, especially in a number of European countries, but others as well, where prior to that point, you had criminalized the written pornography, right? So the idea being that prior to that point, it was not legal in the vast majority of Western countries to actually write novels and material that was sexually explicit in that way. So people wrote romance novels and they wrote about love and intimacy and things like that, but it wasn't sexually explicit and lewd material. The type of things that we might look at today as like 50 Shades of Grey, those types of books, which are now bestsellers, right? In sort of the 50s, those books were not even legal to write and publish, right? You're talking about the type of material that was outlawed. And suddenly those things get decriminalized. And so you have an entire social setting now and cultural moment where lots of free sex is taking place, where the sexual word is now becoming very popular. Pornography really gets a big boost during this time as well. All of these things are going on. And then in the early 70s, you have Roe v. Wade, which is another critical and significant accelerant of this movement. And so now you have legalized abortion, an abortion that's available on demand. And so sex becomes something that has no consequence with the pill. And then if someone does get pregnant, you have abortion as a fail-safe to control in the event of unreliable contraception or simply irresponsible, what we might consider to be irresponsible sexual activity that occurs out of wedlock, or simply the type of sexual activity that leads to a child that is regarded as inconvenient, right? Because when sex has no necessary relationship to the process of bringing children into the world, and children aren't seen as the direct and obvious byproduct of what takes place in the sexual act, right? When children do occur, they're seen as being an exceptional circumstance or an accident, right? As opposed to a sort of blessing that come out of that union, right? And so a number of things right now, what we're seeing as part of the sexual revolution are getting destabilized, which are very, very significant and set the stage for the redefining of gender and sex and sexuality. And so, as I said, sex, reproduction, and marriage, each one is now an independent variable. We look at sex as something that's purely viewed through a sort of hedonistic lens. Reproduction is something that is now controlled and that we self-consciously, deliberately, and intentionally bring about, right? Either through our sort of orchestrated means of sex that is intentionally acted upon in the interest of bringing about reproduction, or through technology, right? So now we have in vitro fertilization and other technological means where reproduction doesn't even necessarily have to occur through the sexual act itself. And then marriage, right? Marriage, when marriage is not bound up in the question of family, when sex can be done outside of marriage without any real social stigma and is casualized, and that type of casualized sex proliferates and becomes commonplace, right? Marriage itself no longer carries significant meaning insofar as an institution that legitimates not only sexual activity, but surrounds the question of family, right? And marriage, in fact, gets redefined as a sort of lifestyle choice and a lifestyle decision. Marriage is the coming together of two people who have similar personalities or personality alignment. They like each other, they want to live together, they want to enjoy each other's company, right? But the idea that they're actually getting into something that is the establishment of something greater than themselves, right? Principally the family, right? Is not a necessary definition or condition of the marriage. And it certainly isn't seen that way today. And when marriage is simply about lifestyle decisions and the lifestyle that we're choosing to lead, it becomes extremely vulnerable. And so what you see during and after the sexual revolution is just skyrocketing rates of divorce as well. Skyrocketing rates of divorce, because when it's simply about sort of mutual pleasurability and enjoyment, the moment that marriage becomes something that's not that enjoyable and not that fun, the commitment begins to wane and divorce becomes the obvious option. So it should not be surprising that as an outgrowth of all of these transitions and trends, we see a demise in the actual family. So the family unit takes a huge, huge hit. Fewer people having children, reproductive rates declining, huge social dislocations with fatherlessness becoming more common, delinquency, right? Children being reconfigured as a sort of inconvenience for the family. And so we have to outsource those types of responsibilities, especially the responsibility of parenting, which is now seen as something that is a strain on one's economic prospects. I can grow my own career, or I can be bound up in trying and sort of chained down with these children and trying to take care of them, right? And so that becomes a very, very prominent discourse, and it is a discourse that lives with us today, right? And this type of discourse can weigh extremely heavily on women, especially mothers, who feel inadequate and insecure at times simply because they are devalued, precisely because their life is ordered around taking care of children and the raising and cultivating of a healthy and positive social context and loving social context for them to be raised within, which is seen as simply carrying less value than their participation in a wage-based economy, right? And being a successful career person. And so many of these things, again, start occurring simultaneously, and the sexual revolution really gives them a shot in the arm. The visibility and prominence of homosexuality, the gay rights liberation movement, ride on these coattails. And what all of this does, is it puts religious believers in a very, very difficult position, because the underlying logic of traditional sexual norms and values cease to make sense. Okay, they simply do not make sense the same way when you've just unraveled so many core components and underlying assumptions and metaphysical commitments that sit at the very core of traditional religion, right? And certainly Islam is part of that. Now, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when we talk about the creation of the male and the female, Allah speaks multiple times in the Quran of the means and his creating of us as men and women. In Surah Al-Layl, وَمَا خَلَقَ الذَّكَرَ وَالْأُنْثَى, and by his creation of the male and the female. And Allah is swearing by his creation of the male and the female. And Surah Al-Najm, وَأَنَّهُ خَلَقَ الزَّوْجَيْنَ الذَّكَرَ وَالْأُنْثَى, and that he created the two mates, the male and the female. In Surah Ali Imran, right, when the mother of Maryam alayhi salam conceives of Maryam, she's surprised. She says, "Inni wada'tuha untha," that I have given birth to a female, right? وَلَيْسَ الذَّكَرُ كَالْأُنثَى, and the male is not like the female, and the male is not like the female. Okay, very, very important verse insofar as it asserts male and female differentiation, right? And we'll get back to this momentarily. We also have Surah Al-Rum, the famous verse that's recited at many weddings. وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ أَنْ خَلَقَ لَكُم مِّنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ أَزْوَاجًا لِتَسْكُنُوا إِلَيْهَا وَجَعَلَ بَيْنَكُم مَّوَدَّةً وَرَحْمَةً إِنَّ فِي ذَلِكَ لَآيَاتٍ لِقَوْمٍ يَتَفَكَّرُونَ. Okay? And of his signs that he created you from yourselves mates, that you might find tranquility in them. And he placed between you affection and mercy, mawadda and rahmah, love and mercy. Indeed, in that are signs for people who give thought. And then also the verse that we perhaps hear oftentimes in the Friday khutbah, or at the start of the Friday khutbah, from Surah An-Nisa, the very first verse. يَا أَيُّهَا النَّاسُ اتَّقُوا رَبَّكُمُ الَّذِي خَلَقَكُم مِّن نَّفْسٍ وَاحِدَةٍ وَخَلَقَ مِنْهَا زَوْجَهَا وَبَثَّ مِنْهُمَا رِجَالًا كَثِيرًا وَنِسَاءً. Okay? O mankind, fear your Lord who created you from one soul and created from it its mate, and dispersed from both of them many men and women. Okay? Now, what we see throughout these verses is a notion of male and female complementarity, that men and women complement one another. Okay? And there is an obvious biological complementarity between men and women, they have been designed in that fashion by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And to put it a bit crudely, when we think about reproduction and procreation, the sort of sexual process the only form in which it can occur is between a man and a woman. There is no proper means or shape by which sex can occur between those of the same sex. Okay? Men and men, women, they don't have, again, putting it a bit crudely, they don't have sort of the material, if you will, or the anatomy through which sexual activity can bring about a family, can bring about children. Okay? And so this complementarity is something that's significant. And then there's also the complementarity not only biologically, but in who they are. This is essential when we start thinking about men and women and male and female differences. Okay? The male and female differences run deep. They exist at the biological level, and not necessarily, and that biological level isn't limited to our anatomy, right? Even when you think about muscle distribution, right? You think about some normative characteristics about height and weight and things like that. You think about brain structure, cellular differentiation, huge differences between men and women normatively when we think about our biological differences, but also huge differences when we think about how men and women participate and assert themselves in the world, right? Dispositionally, which is to say that men and women have different behavioral traits, okay? And that these behavioral traits are a function of how Allah made them, okay? And so men, for instance, take on more assertive characteristics and features, okay? This is not simply a constructed way in which men behave, right? But instead something that is dispositional to men. And this is something, in fact, that we see throughout the male creation, right? You see this even in animal life, right? Where you see sort of male and female animals taking on and assuming different behaviors, right? And so that's very significant. And these differences bear weight when we start thinking about the difference between fathers and mothers. Okay, fathers and mothers are not identical, and they're not interchangeable. They're not interchangeable. Father cannot be a mother, and a mother cannot be a father, right? These are two specific sets of individuals with responsibilities that coincide with their disposition. Okay? The Sharia itself is predicated on not only an acknowledgement of these differences, but in many cases an accentuation of those differences. So when we look at Masail in fiqh, right, there's hardly a chapter of fiqh except that one finds pronounced differences between the obligations and instruction provided to men and those provided to women. They are differentiated, and they are differentiated in ways that correspond to their dispositional traits. So what the Sharia does, what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has done, is given us instruction that imbues within our natural disposition virtue. And the acquiring of a life of virtue is done by following in that path, by following in the path of Allah and His Messenger, alayhi salatu wassalam. And likewise, it mitigates, stifles, and teaches us to restrain and control the more lowly parts that we have within ourselves. Our lowly selves being controlled, governed, and regulated. Okay? And so understanding these differences is important, and we'll talk about this more because one of the critical projects of the modern world is a flattening out of difference. It is a suggestion that we are, in fact, gender interchangeable figures, right? Masculinity and femininity being things that are simply stereotypes that societies have advanced, right? But not something that exists in a more serious or objective capacity, okay? So it's very important to keep this in mind as we continue here, okay? Islamic sexual and gender norms, as many of you know, sex outside of marriage, zina, being strictly forbidden. So adultery and fornication classified as a major sin, okay? Because it undermines one of the most fundamental objectives, maqasid of the Sharia, which is hifz an-nasab, right? The sort of preservation of lineage and genealogical integrity, right? that zina directly undermines that. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا تَقْرَبُوا الزِّنَا. Don't go near zina. Don't go near it. And when he describes it, Azza wa Jal, إِنَّهُ كَانَ فَاحِشَةً وَسَاءَ سَبِيلًا, that indeed it is a lewd transgression and an evil path. And an evil path, the proliferation of zina, unravels and deteriorates the social integrity and communal stability of a society. And that's why the norms in the Sharia don't limit themselves to simply saying don't have sex outside of marriage, but also institute controlling and mitigating measures to minimize the prospect of zina ever coming about. And so no physical contact before marriage between unmarriageable individuals, no khalwa, so men and women who are rather marriageable, I should say. No physical contact between marriageable individuals, no khalwa between a marriageable man and woman. Okay, so they can't be alone together, as the Prophet ﷺ said, when a man and a woman, right, who are sort of non-mahram are alone together, the third with them is shaitan. The third with them is shaitan. Okay, modest dress and behavior, right? That the way ghad al-basar, right? That we have to lower our gaze with one another. And this is a command that Allah has given in the Quran to the believers, believing men and the believing women, right? قُلْ لِلْمُؤْمِنِينَ يَغُضُّوا مِنْ أَبْصَارِهِمْ وَيَحْفَظُوا فُرُوجَهُم. Right? Tell the believing men to lower their gaze and to guard their chastity. وَقُلْ لِلْمُؤْمِنَاتِ, and tell the believing women يَغُضُّضْنَ مِنْ أَبْصَارِهِمْ. Right? To lower their gaze. وَيَحْفَظْنَ فُرُوجَهُم. Right? And to guard their chastity as well. Lowering their gaze and guarding their chastity being something that applies to both genders. And the Islamic teachings on gender are that there are only two, the male and the female. There is an inclusion and acknowledgement of the intersexed individual, like the hermaphrodite, the khuntha mushkil. If you're interested in reading more about that particular category and the underlying fiqh rather, that or the associated fiqh for those categories, or for that category of individual, you can read an article I've written on Muslim matters. It's called "The Male is Not Like the Female." Male is not like the female. Inshallah ta'ala, you'll find a lot of details on the khuntha and the mukhannath and some of the other categories where we see a bit of gender nonconformity being recognized in the Sharia. In any event, continuing here, biological sex and psychological gender are not distinguished. This distinction being critical insofar as the modern world thinks about gender and promotes something called transgenderism. Imitation of the opposite sex is forbidden. And in fact, in the ahadith, the Prophet ﷺ says, or rather, the hadith says that the Prophet ﷺ cursed, la'ana Rasulullah ﷺ, that the curse of the Prophet ﷺ is on the men who imitate the women and women who imitate men. And this is specifically in dress, right? And affectations here, meaning gender-specific behaviors. And so a man who deliberately tries to speak like a woman, right? Sort of lightening his voice and things like that, or walk, right, with his gait and his sway like a woman, right? And so the idea here is, and this is what the scholars have said, is that this is not in reference to the man whose voice is naturally like that. Some men have naturally high voices, right? Nor is it about the man who naturally walks in that way as part of how he's been created, sort of his dispositional walk, but rather about people who are imitating in that way, okay? And certainly dress, very, very clear when it comes to the prohibition about dressing as the opposite sex. Gender transitioning is not recognized, and sex reassignment, sex change surgeries and sex reassignment procedures, strictly forbidden, Moving forward here, let's talk a little bit about history, inshallah. Overall, when we think about transgenderism, we're looking at a very, very recent movement, right? So now we're talking a little bit more detail about transgenderism. Okay, so cross-dresser Virginia Prince is a important figure who coined the term transgenderal, which became transgender, as an alternative to transsexual. And so the idea is to destigmatize the term. Transsexual was the common term, and it really referred to people who had gone through sex changes, right? Transgender is saying, hey, you might or might not have gone through a sex change, but you're still recognized as a category of person because you conceive of yourself that way. right? You're a woman who thinks she's a man, you're a man, right? Now you're a transgendered person, as opposed to someone who has, prior to that, really a medical and mental disorder, right? Gender identity disorder being the category at that time, right? Which itself has been changed, as we'll talk about in the DSM. Sex change surgeries began in 1965 in the US at Johns Hopkins University Hospital. They had a sex and behavior unit center where this began. A very famous Bruce Brenda case. And so this case relates to a young boy named Bruce. He was an infant at the time, and there was a electrocauterization procedure that had been botched by the hospital he was born into. It was done to try to remediate some medical issue that he had in his sort of underlying anatomy, right? And what happened was that the majority of his genitalia was burned off. This was an experimental procedure at the time. And so the infant here, Bruce, was transferred to Johns Hopkins. This behavioral unit at the time, led by a gentleman named John Money, decided that it would be best, now that he didn't have sort of normal functioning male genitalia and that it had been scarred so badly, to simply raise this young boy as a girl. Okay, so they named him Brenda, and it's in fact a very, very tragic story. He had a identical twin who was I forgot the identical twin's name. John Money was actually a very terrible person, quite a bit of very noxious things that he would force this boy to do to try to get him to consider himself a girl. Ultimately, he found out, right? He had threatened to kill himself on more than one occasion. His parents eventually told him, at which point he transitioned in his young teens. His brother and him both ultimately ended up committing suicide. There's actually a book that had been written, an autobiography that this Bruce had helped dictate to another person who had written about this entire story. This particular incident really cast the entire operation in disrepute. In 1979, sex change surgeries as a whole were brought to an end. Studies were published saying that these surgeries were entirely ineffective. John Meyer, not to be confused with John Money, but John Meyer, who ran the unit, said and wrote in these studies, or in one of these studies rather, that sex reassignment surgery confers no objective advantage in terms of social rehabilitation. Okay. Now, from 1979 really until the 2000s, this was, I think, unquestionably regarded, right, when you think about transgenderism, regarded as a sort of pathology, right, a mental illness, if you will. This all changes very, very quickly, and especially over the last 2 decades. The national conversation really starts with Bruce Jenner transitioning out as Caitlyn Jenner, right, and that transition, which hit the news headlines and suddenly becomes a big national story. This new Jenner, Caitlyn, quote unquote, suddenly becomes a media icon and symbol. His picture is now on the front. He goes from being this sort of somewhat obscure, better known for reality television, celebrated athlete, but not really a household name at that level, right? Suddenly becomes a celebrity overnight, a huge celebrated icon, someone who's valorized in media corners and everywhere else. The media and pop culture changes begin to take place and take shape as well. So you start getting more gay affirmative media, news reports, TV shows, movies, music, books, and billboards. So Ellen is obviously a major figure, Will and Grace, others, right, all start to come up. In the 90s, you start to see the seeds of this. So you get more daytime dramas and shows that have as a theme within them someone coming out of the closet, or someone being gay, or someone being lesbian, and the type of difficulties that they're going through. So a big effort to humanize their challenges, right? And to make the audience very sympathetic to the details of who they are and what they're going through and their sort of quote unquote identity. Okay. Teens are also encouraged to question and test out their sexuality and to test out their gender, right? Who says that you have to be a girl in this way? Who says you have to be a boy in this way? You can choose for yourself who and what you want to be. Who says that you have to be straight? Why do you have to be straight? Okay. Jenner wins Woman of the Year for Glamour magazine, right? In the late 2000s, Glamour magazine, front page, right? Front page. Bruce, now Caitlyn, is Woman of the Year, okay? Hardly a week passes now except an actress, athlete, or some media icon comes out identifying as a new gender. So in sort of the 90s and early 2000s, the coming out was as gay. I'm coming out of the closet, right? They were coming out as gay or lesbian. Now they're coming out as a new gender, right? That I'm actually a boy, I'm actually a girl, right? This is constantly occurring. It's a euphoric experience. It is the new coming out of the closet, okay? And there's public support and reinforcement to what they're saying. Anybody who questions this or asks questions or disapproves is shouted down disparagingly. It's a sort of bigotry not to be anything other than supportive for this, okay? And what's really scary about this is how it's increasingly targeting children. SpongeBob, Sesame Street. Sesame Street has an episode about how boys can be whatever they want to be, girls can be whatever there's no one thing that's a boy. There's no one thing that's a girl. Boys can dress how they want to dress. Girls can dress how they want to dress, right? Everybody's different, right? Everybody's different, and everybody can choose who they want to be, right? And so these are shows that target very young children, right? We're talking about shows that children as young as 3 and 4 years old are watching, right? And this is the type of messaging that is targeting them. Disney, right? Coming out with gender non-conforming characters, right? And so now you're talking about cartoon movies where that becomes a key motif and theme in the movie, right? Someone who doesn't want to be who they are, who wants to break social stereotypes and boundaries, right? Whose parents in society is constantly trying to shape them into a particular type of boy or a particular type of girl. But they're saying, no, I want to be myself. This is who I'm going to be, right? All of that begins to transition. Cartoon Network, this is just days ago. Cartoon Network tweets out and Instagram posts all this stuff about how gender is different, right? And everybody can choose their gender, and how young kids can have their own preferred pronouns. Preferred pronouns, right? We're talking about material that is targeted for extremely young children now, that is really pushing all of this messaging. And now what you have is a growing corpus of children's literature that is now doing the same thing. Literally, I mean, very, very large canon now. And it's very difficult. I can tell you as a father myself that my children are young. We go to the library regularly. On more than one occasion, we've picked up books that looked innocuous and innocent. You bring them home, and sometimes it's very late in the book too. Sometimes it's not obvious. It's not right off the bat, right? You get to, we were just reading a book with my children the other day, where one of the key moments in the book, late in the book, was a young boy character wants to participate now in the beauty pageant, right? Now, how come this beauty pageant is just for girls, right? And how come he can't dress up like girls, and things like that becomes part of the story, right? And I can tell you as a parent, this is the point at which you really start, you really have to get creative, right? And pivoting, and you're sweating a little bit and trying to figure out how to explain this to young children about what's going on. So you sort of stop, and now you just start reading ahead before you start getting to books, right? Even very, very young books, right? You have this, I remember there was this book, Tango. I want to say Tango Makes Two, Tango Makes Three, something like that. It's a book about a young boy penguin who really can't make friends with young girl penguins. He just doesn't get along with them the same way he gets along with young boy penguins. Okay, so lots of children's literature, lots of material that's targeting them. And if your children are in public school, there's a high likelihood that this is the type of material that their teachers are bringing them into contact with and teaching them about. Okay, and the older they are, the more explicit it's going to be. Global trends, and these are really just the last couple of years when we start thinking about the way that this is shaping human beings and forming the way they think. Okay. So this is Walter Thompson Innovation Group study. Relatively recently, 48% of 13 to 20-year-olds identify as exclusively heterosexual, which is to say that over half of 13 to 20-year-olds identify as something else. Okay, queer, lesbian, gay, pansexual, some other category. They are filling out that box. They are not referring or considering or conceiving themselves as heterosexual. Millennials, that number is 65% between 21 to 34. So you're seeing how large now the number of young people and people are in general who are coming out and saying, you know what, I might be bi, I might be this, I might be that. I don't want to be straight, right? I'm not just a straight person, okay? Over a third of Gen Z, right? So Generation Z refers to people born in the mid to late 1990s to the early to mid 2010s, strongly agree that gender does not define a person as much as it used to, okay? Over a third, okay? So many of them say, hey, gender is not really that definitional to us anymore. It really doesn't mean as much as it used to at some point in time, okay? And so, this is all very significant here. GLAAD, which is a very prominent LGBT organization in its 2017 Accelerating Acceptance Report, 20% of males identify as LGBTQ, or rather 20% of millennials, not males, 20% of millennials identify as LGBTQ. All right, these are record statistics now for them. 12% of millennials as transgender or gender nonconforming. You have to realize in the 90s, the transgender identification statistics were literally 0.0001 something, okay? We're talking about an infinitesimally small proportion of the human population, which is now, right, self-identified wise, coming out over 10% for some cohorts of human beings generationally, especially young people. More and more of them are default, right, identifying as the opposite gender or transgender. In Sweden, there has been a 1,500% rise between 2008 and 2018 in gender dysphoria diagnoses, right? Gender dysphoria being the underlying condition where a man or a boy thinks he's a girl and vice versa, okay? And this is among 13 to 17-year-olds born as girls. UK young people referred for gender treatment, right? Statistics just from 2009, 97 people in 2009, 2,500 people in 2017, 2,500. So you can see just how large these numbers are growing. And this is absolutely significant for us, especially insofar as you consider the implications of this and the world we're living in, right? The likelihood of having a gender nonconforming or transgender colleague at work, likelihood of having a transgender nonconforming student, right, in a child's class, right? Now much, much higher than it's ever been. And certainly, like in a bigger school, you can take for granted that at least a few of the students will be gender nonconforming or transgender. Even if there isn't one in every class, there will in all likelihood be a few in the school now. When we think about the genealogy of this thought, this is a handful of thinkers. I could have put a lot of people here. In fact, I think there are plenty of names that really could have filled this void. And that could have filled this, not void, but just this slide. When you start thinking about the sheer number of philosophers, especially over the last century and a half, that have contributed into setting the stage for transgenderism and more. A couple I've listed here, Jacques Derrida, deconstructionism. There is no out of context. A very, very famous line from Derrida, right? There's no such thing as out of context. Everything is context laden, right? And so what you get is a certain type of perspectivism, right? Perspectivism. It's all in the eye of the beholder. What is the context that he comes out of? And on a side note, these types of trends I think are very important when we start thinking about transitions and new scholarship that comes in, especially out of the academy, when it reviews and examines Islamic studies and Islamic history. Because now the focus becomes less on the writings of those scholars, so we're not interested in their thought or what they've said on questions of aqidah or fiqh or hadith. What we're more interested in is the backstory. What is their context politically? Because their writings are now political. What is their context socially from a gender perspective, right? How can we look at them through the lens of race? And so now the real story is not what they've written. It's not examining their theological acumen and assertions. It's not even about the project of trying to understand the Quran and Sunnah, but instead about situating individuals and unpacking all of the dimensions that make those individual, that sort of makes the thought of those individuals come about, right? So the hyper contextualization of every individual and their thinking, as opposed to being able to see thought and ideas as objectively valid or invalid on the basis of merit, Because here, merit itself is simply something that one will arrive at through a perspective-laden activity, i.e., it's all subjective. There's subjectivities that are informing those sorts of conclusions, okay? Friedrich Nietzsche, very, very important figure. No facts, only interpretations, okay? Now, Nietzsche itself, when he is saying this and arguing this, he's not saying and not making a statement of subjective realism. He's not saying that whatever you believe is true. But what he's saying is that it's a perspective, okay? He isn't denying that there's a real world, right? He's just saying that the real world is shaped, formed, and brought into being by our perspectives, okay? What is real? It depends on the one who's talking about that reality, okay? Jean-Paul Sartre, or anglicized Sartre, right? A very famous existentialist thinker. He was married to Simone de Beauvoir, the very famous feminist thinker. Existentialism being a domain of philosophical inquiry focused on concrete human existence. All of these thinkers that we're talking about here are very prominently atheistic. So when you talk about the philosophical canon and the contributions over the last century and a half, almost all of the major voices are atheistic, materialists, naturalist in their philosophical conceptions of what exists in the world. For Sartre and Sartre here, life is absurd. How can it be meaningful for us given the absurdity that life has? That is the question. One of his famous lines, we are condemned to be free. And by saying that, he's saying we're responsible for what we make for ourselves. We can't blame anyone else. We are condemned to freedom, okay? And as we see, all of these ideas are in complete and direct contradiction to our own theological norms and our own sort of ontology and our own epistemology and our own anthropology of human being, right? Which we discussed as part of the worldview sessions. Because for us, we're not condemned to be free, and we're not condemned, right? In fact, we are all slaves. And the true question of how we obtain blessing is by embodying and fulfilling our obligation to be slaves to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, okay? Very, very different underlying assumption for how we see human beings and the world itself. Okay, another famous line from Sartre here, existence precedes essence. So we have no essence to begin with. There's no fitrah, there's no disposition that we're born into. There's nothing natural that we can think about, right? We are in fact nothing. We come into the world as blank slates. We have no maker, we have no purpose. What essence comes about is what we shape and form of it, okay? Judith Butler, the last person that I'll talk about here, very, very prominent feminist, still alive and kicking. But Judith Butler has her famous notion of performativity being a very, very popular discourse. She has a famous line in her work, I would say, I can't remember the name of the work, Gender Wars, maybe, something like that. In any event, and this is a very, it's one that's received a lot of attention and has been analyzed a lot in the academy, where this is the closest she comes to really making an ontological contention, where she says, being a lesbian is all I've ever been. Which is to say that Butler isn't saying, I'm a lesbian, but rather I'm acting in this way as a lesbian. I am being a lesbian. We are performers. And yet she cannot be anything else. She can't be anything else other than being a lesbian, okay? And this notion of performativity begins to expand and it gets applied to the notions of gender itself, right? What is a man? What is a woman? What is a male? What is a female? These are roles, right? So gender roles becomes a big part of our discourse. Why do we refer to that term? Because it's a role that we're taking on. right? Society has made these stereotypical roles, and we're born into them without a real choice. And they get reinforced by the names we're given, and by the expectations that are applied upon us, and by the media, and by society, and culture, and everything else, telling us this is your role, right? Act according to it. And so within this grand social theater, we behave according to those expectations, right? And so we bring these roles into being through environmental factors and through our own performances. And we continue to re-articulate them every day of our lives. So there really isn't, if two people were just on an island, would they, or a group of people were just born blank slate on an island, would they naturally arrive at male and female? But they're saying no way, right? They may arrive at something totally different. And they're going to arrive at that difference through their environmental factors and what they find themselves within. And as a result of that, what they will do is calcify and reify a new constructed enterprise of how they want to divide themselves as human beings and see themselves. Okay? And this type of attitude is now so common amongst otherwise respected and very intelligent and sophisticated people, right? And so I remember listening to a talk by, and this was Deborah Rhodey, who's a very, very prominent sort of feminist academic, right? She's professor of law, I want to say, at Stanford. So not as big on the feminist side, but certainly a very prominent female academic. And she was talking about this. And the analogy she gave, which I was quite surprised by, was the analogy of a dog, okay? And so the same way that we look at a dog, and historically dogs were in the wild, and we domesticated the dog. We brought them in our homes, and we trained them, and we taught them into how to behave in the home. And we did this generationally, where now the entire breed of dog is the domesticated dog, which is a completely different breed than the undomesticated or wild dog. And the idea is that if we can domesticate dogs and completely manipulate and shape their behavior and what they eat and how they behave, right? A domesticated dog doesn't bite, right? Doesn't bite. That's not a natural behavior for a dog in the wild. They're using their teeth all the time. They're attacking. They're aggressive, right? The domesticated dog is loving and friendly and, likes to get pet and all those types of things, right? And if that's what we can do with animals, human beings are simply another category of animal. Are simply another category of animal in this reading and understanding of the world. Okay? All of this sets the groundwork for transgenderism and certainly much more. Postmodernism and some of the thought that we've spoken about here with the past slide destabilizes the notion of objectivity and our ability to know anything in a sort of objective capacity, that we can speak assertively about truth and falsehood, right? Consider how difficult it becomes to speak about theology, right? To speak about right and wrong, morals and values and truth, right? As Muslims, this becomes a very difficult thing to assert now. And to an increasing number of Muslims, those types of dialogues are seen as judgmental, inappropriate, right? Why are you judging people in this ways? Well, that's just your opinion. That's your reading of the text, right? There must be a difference of opinion based on how scholars have viewed that language. And so what begins to flourish in this moment is sort of the burgeoning of ikhtilaf. Right? We celebrate the notion of ikhtilaf because ikhtilaf enters us into the same domain of subjectivity, of perspectivalism, right? Of the idea that independent people who are formed and shaped by their own contexts and factors can take away different ideas from texts. Okay? The sexual revolution untethers sex from procreation and family. Okay? And so now how we think about sex, how we think about family gets weakened, right? Children become more of a burden. Fewer and fewer people now having children, right? Reproductive rates throughout the West now at historic lows. The vast majority of the West not even at replacement levels. And so the vast majority of countries in the West are now in population decline. Individualism makes us hostile to mediating structures like family, community, church. It's all about me. It's all about me. So we become very nafsani. We become people who are focused on living very hedonistic, self-centered, selfish lives, narcissistically oriented. Technologies like social media feed these indulgences, okay? Feminism, right, flattens gender difference. There is no gender difference, okay? The only differences that we see are the ones that we shape and form through our actions and our language, okay? Performativity says that we, in fact, make the very concept of gender itself come into being. So when all of these things exist at the ground level, right, it should not be surprising that we get transgenderism and we begin to lose track of, well, what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? Right? The type of things that societies have never questioned and taken for granted from time immemorial are now major questions that we can no longer seem to figure out. So there is at the heart of this and at root an amalgamation and a great separation. Modern Western cultures separate three things that have been and are tightly bound up with each other: sexual activity, reproduction, and marriage. You remove those and you separate them apart, and suddenly homosexuality and everything else and gay marriage becomes not only sort of acceptable, but logically consistent with how these things have been newly understood. If marriage is simply a lifestyle choice, why are you stigmatizing and mistreating one lifestyle, right? Why aren't you actually acknowledging that? Because it's simply a lifestyle decision. It has no necessary relationship to reproduction or family. It also separates out and creates a distinction between biological sex, gender identity expression, and sexual orientation. These three things have no necessary relationship at all anymore, okay? Which is why a person can effectively be whatever they want to be. We live in gender neutral spaces. We are interchangeable beings, men and women, women and men. These are just words without any great meaning attached to them. And on the other hand, it amalgamates things that Islam insists should be kept rigorously separate, namely desires, actions, and identity, okay? Because actions is what brings about moral culpability, but now what happens is a person has identities that correspond to their desires, right? I desire to have sex with this person, that is now my identity. My identity is that I'm gay or straight. My identity is that I am a trans man or a trans woman because I desire to be a man or a woman instead of what I was born into, okay? Or rather, who I am, in fact, actually am. Okay? Now, next couple of slides, I'm going to be focusing in a little bit more on transgenderism itself as a phenomenon, okay? Transgenderism is an umbrella term for persons whose gender identity, gender expression, or behavior does not conform to that typically associated with the sex to which they were assigned at birth. Okay, this is the APA definition. Note the terminology, right? Assigned at birth. Sex is simply something that we get assigned. It's a product of birth certificates and dialogue. It's a discursive category. It's something that we have spoken into being. It's not something that exists in an objective format. Okay, and what's really interesting about transgenderism is that there are seemingly two contradictory notions at the heart of it. One is gender constructionism, the idea that we have constructed gender and we can reconstruct it. And yet, at the same time, it requires us to buy into gender essentialism, right? That if you believe that men and women have no underlying essence, then why am I becoming a trans woman or a trans man when I'm dressing differently? Why wouldn't I still be a woman or a man? Right? Because the logical implications of that only makes sense, right? Rather, that logic only makes sense if you're willing to accept that men and women have some differences, right? And that you're behaving according to a different, right, sort of sexual expression. But when you deny that difference, right, how does transgenderism hold, right? Again, these sort of contradictory notions are never fully squared out, right? And so there's simply things that sort of exist, are spoken about, and persist away, but they're not really subject to really strong individual or personal inquisition, as it were, right? So conceptually speaking, you have a number of terms, thoughts, and categories here that sort of get off scot-free in some sense. Okay. At the heart of the transgender movement are radical ideas about the human person, in particular that people are what they claim to be. A transgender boy is a boy, not merely a girl who identifies as a boy. And we see this now in our public square, in public discourse, where when a person has transitioned, quote unquote, right? It's not a girl who has transitioned to a boy, but it is now a boy. The pronouns, everything is adjusted. Everything is adjusted. There's no means by which you can acknowledge that, right? That there has even been a transition. The mere presence of the transition is something that should not be spoken about. It is now boy. It is now he, right? And this is a he. And everything that would apply from a pronoun, linguistically, behaviorally, everything should now just continue without any serious fuss or concern or question. Okay, now a couple of things that are debated within transgenderism. First question is transgenderism something that is inherent? Okay, this is a very similar debate to the type of debate that has occurred in the context of homosexuality, which is sort of the debates around the gay gene, right? On a side note, there is no sort of medical evidence to support the gay gene. The biggest study on this was published by the New Atlantis. When I say last year, very, very lengthy study on the topic. If you have time, you can look it up, inshallah. But now arguments today are appealing to the same biological, sort of biological root, the biological source argument. And so the common assertion is that where transgenderism originates is the brain. So there's a trans brain. And so a sort of girl who believes herself to be a boy actually has a male brain or trans brain. Okay. Now, there are a lot of studies on this. Inshallah ta'ala, tomorrow, I believe, I have a lengthy piece that will be coming out on this subject of transgenderism, which will get into these studies and really details on them, inshallah. So people who want to review them certainly can there. So inshallah, you can review that if you will. But suffice to say that the brain root argument, right, is not a strong argument. Let's just leave it there. It's not an argument that is scientifically supported, not really supported scientifically, although people continue to make the claim and take for granted that in fact that is the root of it, and that's where it all comes from. So we'll talk here about the different types of transgenderism, and this is something that I think perhaps will strike some people as interesting. Most people have a very sort of cursory understanding of transgenderism, which is to say they sort of understand it at a very superficial high level, but they don't understand the different manifestations of it and the way in which it takes on different trends or manifestations, okay? And so one manifestation of transgenderism is what is referred to as early onset GD, rather early onset gender dysphoria. Okay, early onset gender dysphoria refers to childhood gender dysphoria. Okay, so we're talking about really children, often prepubescent, who believe that they are the other gender. Okay, published literature shows in the past that 60 to 90% of children whose gender dysphoria began before puberty adjusted to their birth sex without requiring a gender transition, which is to say that they naturally realigned after puberty. After puberty, they naturally realigned, okay? Up to 90%. Children with childhood onset gender dysphoria have a much higher likelihood of non-heterosexual outcomes based on studies compared with typical children, especially men. Some of the correlations here or what they've seen sort of by way of relationships is that those with lower socioeconomic status and children with autistic traits are more susceptible to early onset gender dysphoria, and it is a predictor of persistence. The modern trans movement pushes the idea of social transitioning very, very hard. And in fact, this is something which is referred to as affirmative therapy. Affirmative therapy is now orthodoxy across the vast majority of Western psychotherapeutic spaces. There is now a push to outlaw and ban anything other than affirmative therapy. And affirmative therapy teaches children that are having these types of thoughts and ideas that, look, it's okay to explore it, and parents should be supportive of it in a way that supports that exploration. And so what you might have, just to think of the example, you'll have a young boy who's 6 years old and his name is Ahmad, right? And so what the therapist will say is, how about 2 or 3 days a week, Ahmad can be Safiya. And Safiya can dress up as a girl, and we'll treat Safiya as a girl, and we'll let Safiya wear a wig and makeup, and he can pick his own clothes, they can go shopping and this and that. And 5 days he'll be Ahmad and 2 days Safiya. And if he likes being Safiya and he looks forward to those days, maybe we'll start making it 3 and 4, right? 3 days Safiya, 4 days Ahmad, and then maybe 4 and 3. And as he grows up, Ahmad can begin to make decisions as to which days he wants more and more, okay? So this becomes sort of the therapeutic movement, where it's sort of like very much encouraging the idea of the social transitioning taking place, with sort of the name and the dress and the treatment and the social setting and everything else being there to encourage this type of transition, okay? So this is something simply to keep in mind, because you think about what counselors are going to tell children, right, in the classroom. You think about what a therapist might tell your child, even a medical professional like a pediatrician. I have personally encountered young children who are struggling, Muslim children, who are struggling with gender dysphoria, and whose pediatricians told them that, hey, you're actually a girl, or you might be a girl, you should actually try this out, right? And then spoke to the parents as well, saying the same thing. And so when you think about just how pervasive this has all become, this is certainly a major part of it. Another phenomenon which has really grown in the last couple of years is what they refer to as rapid onset gender dysphoria. It's when it occurs suddenly. There's no prior trace or indication that the person was feeling anxious over their gender. And this is extremely acute in young adolescent and adult females. So you think about teenage girls, right, especially amongst that age, over 80% female in studies for rapid onset gender dysphoria. Research on rapid onset gender dysphoria, the biggest study was done by a woman named Lisa Littman with Brown University. Her study was peer-reviewed, a very controversial study. In fact, when it got published, Brown University unpublished the study and pulled it off their site because of how angry trans activists were. The core contention in her study is that socialization and social contagion, i.e. peer pressure, is the single greatest factor that brings about rapid onset gender dysphoria. Girls are transitioning because they find their friends transitioning, because they're feeling pressured through the media and culture and society, and by the online spaces that they're in. They're feeling alienated and unfulfilled as women, right? And as girls, it's tough being a girl today, right? So they have this unhappiness, anxiety, they have life problems, they all come together, right? And they produce, this individual says, you know what, maybe I'm just going to become a boy, right? And so you have instances now where like a girl will become a boy and her entire friend circle will also transition, right? So 4, 5, 6 girls, they all transition at the same time. This is how rapid onset gender dysphoria tends to work. And there's a huge surge in cases over the past few years. Rapid onset gender dysphoria also correlates with a higher, or corresponds to a higher rate in self-harm. So you think about cutting and other forms of self-harm. It also has a relationship with some mild forms of autism. Again, the sort of recommendation here is to do whatever you can to delay any consideration of gender transitioning when this occurs. Okay? And as you know, with like teenagers, what's going on now is that there's an entire playbook, the online forums and everything else. Trans influencers on YouTube have very explicit instruction on this, right? Threaten suicide, tell your parents how much you hate them and that they're making you miserable, try to run away from the home and leave there for as many nights as you can, make your parents terrified. I mean, really scary advice. Very, very scary material. And this is all out there now. It's all public, and the sort of threats that are being pushed for teenagers, right? Who are being taught and instructed very prescriptively as to how to go about all of this. Autogenophilic gender dysphoria is perhaps the type of gender dysphoria that was the most common historically. And by historically, I mean really pre-2000s. Okay, when we sort of thought about gender identity disorder and transsexualism and everything else, this was the category. And autogenophilia refers to a male being sexually aroused by the fantasy of being a woman. Okay, so autogenophilic males are turned on by thinking about themselves as women or behaving like women. It was a term coined by Ray Blanchard. It is a contested term, and so there are people who contest this actual terminology. Often feels sudden, though rarely is. It can be in adolescents and can be in adults. Internet research, as I said, transgender reforms, they play a very significant role. Historically speaking, this was something that often materialized in transvestitism, which was sort of cross-dressing and things like that. Many males with autogenophilia are content just to cross-dress on occasion. Some get married to women, many also have children, they have a family, things like that. Over 75% of reassignments in the past were autogenophilic, right? Now, fewer men cop up to these feelings and in fact just say that they believe themselves to be a woman. And Ray Blanchard and others have written about this extensively, basically arguing that they're just reading a new script, right, as opposed to expressing their authentic underlying feelings, because in reality, human beings don't change in that way, right? You can't sort of change humans. And you can't have decades of research that tells you one thing and then suddenly you have a new discourse that pops up. Now everyone's just aping and parroting that new discourse, okay? The DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM-5 in 2012, there's a shift in terminology. So what was gender identity disorder now becomes gender dysphoria. And it denotes the shift in emphasis from the identity incongruence, i.e. I see myself as a woman or man, to the presence of distress. So gender dysphoria, the problem isn't that a man believes he's a woman or she believes she's a man, right? But in fact that they have distress and anxiety as a result of that feeling. So it's really the distress that becomes the bigger category. The World Health Organization said the scientific evidence is now clear that gender incongruence is not a mental disorder, and acknowledged that classifying it as such can cause enormous stigma for people who are transgender. Okay, so now you have medical group after medical group reconfiguring and just openly changing their prior medical opinions to coincide with the latest transgender fads. Okay. Complications, and this is the last slide, and then what I'll do is I'll sort of open it up and maybe take some questions. I know this is a lot of very heavy material, but I think it's important for us, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, to understand. Many medical interventions prevent a very, very serious risk. For children, for instance, one of the common practices once they start hitting adolescence is the introduction of puberty suppressing medications. There are a number of studies that were published by medical professionals that said puberty suppression actually has no costs at all or medical implications. Now the medical implications are really being understood, and that entire discourse is now being backtracked. Okay, one of the biggest is that puberty suppressing medication actually stifles the growth in bone density. And so when children who are supposed to go through puberty take puberty suppressing medication, what happens is they don't see a growth in bone density. And over 50% of our eventual bone density growth occurs during puberty, right? During those crucial teenage years. And so now what happens is you have people who are growing up at acute risk for early osteoporosis and brittle bones and bone fracturing, right? That for girls who go through puberty suppression, there is a risk of lifelong infertility, and so never being able to conceive or give birth to a child. You have very high rates of suicidality, even for those who transition, even for those who go through sex change surgeries, right? 41% try to kill themselves at some point in their lives, compared with less than 5% of the general public. And as I said, the link between autism spectrum disorder and transgenderism non-negligible. So it becomes something that really preys on the vulnerable and weak and marginalized members of society. And so we'll we will stop there and open up for questions. Hopefully, you know, there was some benefit here. Let's start. Okay. Okay, so someone has something about, you know, they don't see what's special about Maryam alayhi salam. Just read the Quran and Sunnah. There are a lot of good lectures on the life of Maryam alayhi salam. Allah Azza wa Jalla preferred her over all of the women of mankind, and she is certainly a paragon of piety. There's no one that compares to that, and so I would suggest simply reading more on that, beyond the scope of here to really go into a large lecture on Maryam alayhi salam. Okay, one parenting technique I've come across is to tell children that transgender attitudes are incorrect. So we don't believe in them, but society doesn't want people to get hurt. So instead of approaching these people harshly and them getting picked on, we are just told by society to accept them. Instead of accepting them, that we will not pick on them. I see this as an attempt to be practical, but still falling slightly short. What is your opinion? Again, this is. I think a person has to have. I think you have to sort of apply some discernment to this. So there's the question of picking on people. Certainly, we would say that, like, you don't want to like hurl insults at people and be abusive or anything like that. We wouldn't want to bully people, right? So I think we can sign on all of those things. The idea that, you know, the question is, what does it mean to like, you know, pick on a person, right? Does it mean, for instance, if you have a trans boy, quote unquote, like a girl who transitioned to a boy, telling that girl that she still has to use the girl's bathroom, is that picking on her? Is continuing to refer to her with her pronoun of a feminine pronoun, is that picking on her? Is reminding her that she's actually a female and not a male picking on her? Okay. Now, I'm not suggesting that all of those things need to be done at once, but I'm saying that certainly some of those, right, would definitely be in the equation, right? And if we're not doing those things, then what we're actually doing is abetting a mental disorder, right? And we're actually creating, we're worsening a situation, we're enabling, right, a person who is psychologically suffering. We're enabling a person who is psychologically suffering, right? And the idea is that when someone is doing something that is detrimental to their health and well-being, we want to be supportive to them, but we also want to help them as part of that supportive cycle, get out of the vicious cycle that they're in, right? And to heal them and to bring them to a place where they can be healthy once again, okay? And we would do that with anything. And so part of sort of the pastoral practice that we have to approach with any individual is also speaking to them plainly. And just like any other person who has gotten habituated into doing destructive behaviors, some of that speech may be a bitter pill to swallow for them. And it may be something that requires some tough love. And in other instances, it may require gentleness. But in almost all situations, it is not simply going to be abetting what they're doing, right? Because you would recognize right off the bat that there's something fundamentally harmful about what's going on, and you don't want to contribute to that harm. And Allah knows best. Anonymous attendee, how applicable are 7th century or rather pre-modern gender norm expectations today? Prophet lived in a society where there were the option of multiple wives, concubines, sex with women, and procreation. Divorce happened frequently, and children were raised more by the society mates than the way they are raised today. Hold on, I just lost my place, sorry. Than they were raised today, attention of the parents. The sex-related context of Muslims in America today does not at all seem the same as Muslim society of the past. How then can we use examples of the past and apply them to today's world? How is tradition meant to adapt to social changes around us? Women getting more educated, men more inclined towards childcare, etc. And if social roles can change, what does that tell us about understanding of Quran's distinction between roles and men? So first of all, I think this is a very sort of like modernist perspective towards an evaluation of the past, right? One can certainly say that there have been transitions over the past century that have changed gender norms, or rather the expectations that surround them, right? And that they differ from not only the Prophet ﷺ's time, but for the vast majority of human history, okay? Certainly one can say that there was the option of multiple wives. Multiple wives option in theory is still available today, even if there are legal complications, right? Some might say that, and certainly for some it may not necessarily be an option. Divorce happening frequently, I think that's a bit overstated. Certainly it happened, and people got remarried, right? And we see this in the life of the Sahaba. But the idea that people were just getting married, divorced at similar rates today is, I think, a transposition of our social circumstances on theirs, right? And I think not true at all, right? In fact, divorce was frankly far less common. It wasn't the same as Catholicism, right? Where divorce was basically looked at as something that, marriage was sort of de facto lifelong, right? And divorce was a type of sinful activity that could only be licit if the church explicitly signed off and annulled the marriage, right? Obviously, that's not the Islamic conception of it, but the Islamic conception is something that makes it less desirable and happen far less frequently. And we see this even in traditional Muslim societies, where divorce didn't happen nearly as much just like a century ago, right? In our grandparents' generations, let's say. Children were raised more by the society maids. Again, I don't think this is true at all. I mean, the idea that people were just had maids raising their kids. Maybe this is true today in some Muslim countries where people have maids and servants and stuff in their homes that are doing the majority of the legwork. But the idea that parents were not intimately involved in raising children, in fact, teaching them how to become adults, right? At very young ages, they were taking on adult expectations and they were assuming adult positions, whether it was working, right, in the household, working out in the fields, working out vocationally, right? They had to be able to assume them and participate in them at very young ages, and they became adults, right, at very young ages, as opposed to our societies where you have basically extended adolescence and you can have someone in his 30s who's still very much a child in his behavior, right? This is very new. And so, of course, right, someone might say that the sexuality context of Muslims in America is very different because America is very different, but we're looking at that, and part of what we're trying to get across here is that those transitions that have occurred are unnatural transitions, and they're the types of transitions that are eroding the social stability of the family unit. They're eroding the social stability of men and women, and even their sort of psychosocial health as individuals. They're creating situations in which people are experiencing acute forms of depression. It has completely alienated and isolated people. You have academic departments now throughout the West which are focused on loneliness studies. In the UK, you have an appointed minister of loneliness that is now tending to the type of loneliness factors that individuals are dealing with because they are all alone in their homes, living in front of screens. Okay, so less and less human engagement, less human beings, and you have a pathologizing of normal human behavior. Okay, and so there are these expectations that are really bearing tremendous consequences on people and resulting in profound levels of dissatisfaction, people who have no fundamental underlying meaning in their world and are being taught and conditioned to behave and live in ways that are just functionally unnatural, right? And it's really astonishing when you read studies on this, that for instance, today, when women are studied who have children, 20% continue to say that they would prefer, if they had their choice, to be stay-at-home moms permanently, and 60%. So if you look at the total sort of umbrella, 80%, right? 60% of women preferring to stay at home and having flex work arrangements where they can work, some weeks just a handful of hours, maybe no hours, maybe another week 10 or 15 hours, but highly flexible arrangements that give them broad latitude to give extreme preference to their household when and if they need it, okay? So you're talking about 80% of women who continue to say that if they had the choice, they would do things that way. And you think about that in a society that has so devalued motherhood, that literally treats motherhood with derision at times, right? And speaks down about mothers and sees mothers as contributing nothing, but because there's no capital contributions that they're making, because they have no careers, right? In sort of a money-making perspective, right? And this is something that is completely anathema to any traditional society, which looked at motherhood as the single greatest occupation and the single most honored occupation that a human being could assume. There is no traditional society except that you find them honoring mothers. And this is universal. This is universal, right? If you look at sort of historical Confucian societies and filial piety and just how mothers are spoken about in their literature and poetry, even medieval European societies, certainly traditional Muslim societies, the is the highest, And in fact, even that term, in Arabic, has a connotation of the greatest, of the most significant, right? Of significance, right? Mecca being al-Qura, right? Sort of the most significant town, village, right? That's al-Qura, right? That's why Mecca has that term. Mecca has that term, okay? Or carries that moniker, if you will, right? This is what motherhood carried the connotations of. And the Prophet ﷺ was asked, to whom do I owe the greatest responsibility for my devotional care and companionship? He said, your mother, alayhi salatu wasalam. And then when he was asked, then who? He said, your mother. Then who? Mother. Then who? Father. Mother, 3 consecutive times. 3 consecutive times. In the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala calls out the mother specifically. حَمَلَتْهُ أُمُّهُ كُرْهًا, right? That the mother carried this pregnancy and child in difficulty. In other words, وَهْنًا عَلَى وَهْن. وَهْنًا عَلى وَهْن, right? Right? That it's wahan, right? A sort of difficulty that they had to endure in pregnancy. Okay? And so this is something that's very, very different than modern societies. And as Muslims, we have to work very hard to try to inculcate in our families the types of values that emerge from the Quran and Sunnah, and not simply refactor and reconfigure and completely lose all of our values in the process of assimilating into a dysfunctional social arrangement. Okay? Because that would be tremendously consequential, and it would completely unravel the entire family unit at its root. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Okay, we allow our kids to be friends with someone of the same gender. Sorry, just moved up. Hold on, I lost 1 second. Still on this. Actually, let me do this. Sorry. Okay, lost my place here. We only allow our kids to be friends with someone of the same gender. How can we ensure any experimentation is going on when they are too young to bring up these topics, since we can't control their children? If they go to public school, what is the best way? I mean, the most you can do is really mitigating factors, right? You spend time with your children, you're a positive influence in their lives, you have a strong relationship with them, a loving relationship, particularly when they're young. You have them, their friends, you try to make sure that their friends are also with families that you know of and that share your relationship, or rather share your values, right? They share your values. And so, you know, you're building social networks between families that are similar to yours, that have your values, that really place a high priority on taqwa and piety and being good Muslims. And, you know, those are the best things that we can do, right? Those are the best things we can do. Even the best approach will always carry some risk, right? In the sense that there's no way to 100% mitigate and control these things. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to protect our children, right? And we make dua for them day and night, right? And so I'd say that these are all mitigations that we can do to hopefully and sort of reduce the likelihood of some of these complications. Next question. Would you say there are societies that have different assigned roles? Again, I want us to get out of the sort of habit of speaking in the language of performativity, right? The idea of roles is a very modern idea, right? Assigning roles, right? This isn't like what we've just gone to great lengths to show is that gender isn't simply an assignment of role, but it's a dispositional behavior that we come out of as a consequence of how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us, right? If we're saying that men and women behave differently in those societies and societies have different expectations on them, okay, but this sort of assigning role language and verbiage, it's very, very sort of postmodern, new age feminist language that has become the way in which many people talk simply through their own sort of indoctrination into this discourse and assimilation into it. In any event, it said, if so, how does this affect our understanding of gender? Surely the Quran does not speak of animals when it talks about gender difference. We know certain female animals are larger than others, or certain. So I'm not sure what this question is necessarily getting at. Okay, well, one can certainly say, okay, that men and women behave differently in different societies, right? That it's not all identical or uniform. We would say nonetheless that there are underlying similarities, right? That are cut cross-culturally, right? It's not plastic enough where we're just going to say it's all interchangeable or neutral, and all it is a byproduct of social arrangement. right? It's not as if in some societies, right, it's just, there's no such thing as motherhood, there's no such thing as fatherhood, right? Or that, the things that women, for instance, are now like the majority of the warriors and soldiers, right, traditionally, because fighting in war and combat was something that required and came out of the notion of sort of personal strength. The women were protected in traditional societies, right? And this was the case even for Aboriginal societies and tribes, right? The fact is that the way in which sex itself, sexual difference, has been maintained in past societies has been immensely common across past societies, right? And there is an extent to which people exaggerate seemingly minor differences, whereas the sort of broader complexion of similarities across them is really the bigger story. And I'll say this even in things that we might assume to be very much socially informed. And so I'll give you an example of this. One of the major research studies that made rounds in the last decade and a half was a research study that came out and said that color preferencing, specifically girls liking pink and boys liking blue, right? That sort of color preferencing was a late modern 20th century invention of America and Western societies. And that, in fact, if you look across societies in the past, anthropologically, people have had all sorts of color preferencing, and pink and blue wasn't necessarily the case. In the aftermath of that study, you have had a number of very, very significant studies done anthropologically, psychotherapeutically, and otherwise. Psychopathology, very prominent psychopathologists who have reviewed those studies and actually refuted them, and actually shown that color preferencing is far more stable, even color preferencing, across societies and times and places than we would otherwise assume, right? Which isn't to say that there isn't a social factor at all, but it is to say that it's much more dynamic and involved and contributed to by a variety of factors that are not merely environmental and social, okay? And that's just color preference, right? When you think about everything else, in terms of the assertiveness of men, right? There's no society in the world where women are the majority of the prison population. Men are the majority of the prison population, every country in the world, right? Why is that? Is it because men are being socially conditioned into criminality? Or is it because they have certain forms of aggressive behavior that come more naturally to men, right? And risk-taking. Risk-taking is another feature of men. One of the big studies, and something that has been paid a lot of attention to, is something referred to as the Nordic paradox. The Nordic paradox is focused on Scandinavian countries, and Scandinavian countries, as most of us know, have done a lot of work to try to insist upon gender egalitarian social spaces. And so they have laws and policies throughout those countries that require, for instance, quotas for different professions and places and admissions into universities and all that, for minimums for women, very, very generous perks and benefits for women when it comes to things like maternity leave and all that type of stuff. There's so much effort that's gone into promoting gender equality in every single space. And the reason they call it the Nordic paradox is that the gender differences between men and women in these countries is actually higher than in countries that haven't done all that work, okay? And so part of the conclusion that many researchers have come through as part of this is simply the fact that, okay, if unimpeded, right, and all the obstacles are removed, what happens is that men and women simply behave in ways that come naturally to them, which are differentiated, right? So fewer women go into STEM in the Nordic regions than they do even in America, right? And so you'll see this, and this is one of the this is one of the studies that I think is quite compelling as well. You can take a look at even now transgenderism, right? One of the first things you'll see about transgenderism and transgender studies are now self-reports from people who start going through hormone therapy. So girls who start getting testosterone treatment, this is ubiquitous now. There are so many personal diaries and things like that, where after they start getting testosterone treatment, what they'll say is, like, now all I'm thinking about is sex, right? Like, I can't believe how much it's on my mind. And that men who start getting female hormone therapies like estrogen treatment and things like that, they say that I now never think about sex. It's so liberating and this and that. They start talking about and they write about these things publicly, right? Because there's a consequence to this. There's a consequence to all of this. And it's not simply a socially constructed enterprise. And Allah knows best. So that question done, hopefully. Assalamu alaikum. Next question. I'm wondering if being asexual, not attracted to any gender, is halal. Who a person is attracted to, they are not sinful for that attraction, right? When we talk about the halalness of something, okay? What is haram is what a person does by their actions. What a person does by their actions. And so long as someone does not commit sexually indecent behavior and they live pious lives, they are not doing anything haram. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. And in fact, they are doing something that is virtuous. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for hidayah in that. The next question, what's the ruling on mut'a marriages? Mut'a marriages are forbidden. And Allah knows best. Allah knows best. A neighbor who has a child same age as mine often comes by to chat. Lately has been asking me to watch their child occasionally. The child same age as mine often comes by to chat. They ask me to watch their child occasionally. Do I continue befriending them? How to approach? Well, I mean, it depends, right? I mean, is there something wrong with the kid? Are you worried about the child and the influence that that child is having on your child, right? If you are concerned about that, then you should try to figure out an approach where you're not being offensive, but perhaps creating some distance. If the child is not the bad influence and it is a nice child and all that, then it may not be a problem. Allah understand. So, next question, and we'll maybe take a few more. Sheikh Azimuddin, I know I'm sort of over time by a few minutes. How many more should I take here just to close it out? I can do maybe 3 or 4 more. Does that work? The moderator brothers, Abdullah, Farhan, is that okay? 3, 4 more questions?
I'll let the moderator speak. I was just listening in.
Okay. Is 3, 4 more questions good? Or
you could take 3, 4 more. Inshallah.
Okay, I'll try to make them quick. Okay. So we're done with the neighbor question. If a person is born with a physical disorder at birth, we have the technology now to treat it. If a person feels like they have the wrong gender and are being affected by it negatively to the point of suicide, why can't they change their genders? Number one is that they can't change their genders. Okay, right? That's we'd say conceptually, it's an impossibility. It's an impossibility, right? If a man has a male genitalia and you castrate that genitalia, it doesn't make that man a woman, right? You're simply dressing up as a woman. Right? And the idea is that if people are being emotionally negatively impacted and they're experiencing suicidality, they need therapy, they need psychotherapy, they need therapeutic support, and they need help and assistance. And what we found, and in fact, there are a number of studies now that say this, that actually medical intervention does not mitigate the likelihood of suicidality, and in fact can increase it in a great number of cases. And so the idea that we just have to sign on to this because we don't want people to commit suicide, well, even the empirical evidence doesn't support that necessarily. Allah knows best. As a Muslim woman, next question, I feel very anti-feminist because of what Sharia teaches with gender roles. Again, just get out of the gender role language. It just shows, I think, at a very deep level, just how much these notions have been integrated into our thinking. There's an article that I wrote on this called I want to say on the perils of constructionism on my blog, medium.com/occasional reflections. You can take a look at that, inshallah, and it goes into a lot of detail on some of these empirical studies and research and really how as Muslims we should be looking at gender. I've written other pieces on gender as well on that same blog. There's one called Male, Female, and Sexual Gender Difference. But yeah, that's those are a couple of articles which I would suggest. And if you go to medium.com/occasional reflections, inshallah, you should find those articles.
Mobeen?
Yes.
There was a clarification on the neighbor question. The person was saying that I meant to say that the neighbors are a lesbian couple.
Oh, Allahu Akbar. Okay. Yeah. Then I mean, obviously that is a concern because your child is now coming into regular contact with a sort of lesbian parent arrangement, right? Obviously, if they've been exposed to that, then that's perhaps something that is worth having a conversation with your child about and explaining to them that it's not something that's right or okay. That's obviously a complicated scenario. That really is a complicated scenario. For your child, right, you need to consider their well-being and the extent to which they're going to be influenced by prolonged exposure to that type of household. And if you're concerned about that, then figuring out ways to create distance there would certainly be appropriate. And Allah knows best. Now, this person feels very anti-feminist. Is that appropriate? Is there a fine line where certain topics will blur? So if I understand this question, this person feels anti-feminist because they see the Sharia as contradicting feminism. That's fine. I mean, I don't see a problem with that. I would say that that's not a problem at all. And that, ultimately, like, we shouldn't allow ourselves to be overwhelmed or overcome by these sort of philosophical and intellectual trends and currents, but instead we should try to focus on a positive articulation of what the Sharia says and asserting that to the extent that we can, alongside warning people about the types of gender flattening that we see taking place around us. Now, question, what resources are available to speak to children and have such conversations on how to navigate this outside of the home? That's a good question. There are some books that have come up in recent years, but they're mainly Christian publications. So I'd have to go back and check them. I don't know any, just to be candid, that Muslims have done on this subject. I literally don't know of a single one that Muslims have done here that focuses on sort of children and gender and all that type of stuff. So that might be a place to start looking out for some of these things, inshallah. There are some books I know that have been written, which I've heard are good, on like what that focus on things like pornography and stuff like that, like look at this, don't look at that type of thing. But again, I'd say look those up. There's some good Christian outlets, I believe, that have read mentioned some books for children on that. And Allah knows best. And this is perhaps one of those areas, to be honest, where there really is a vacuum for us as a community, where we need more contributions, right? Really accessible, simple literature for our children that can teach them their values. Aside from that, there are a lot of books that we have that teach children. They're just not focused on these types of issues, right? Next question, as an environmental scientist, I think another aspect of gender dysphoria issue is the uncontrolled introduction of neurotoxins and many other kinds of chemicals that are or should be categorized as toxic, dangerous in food, water, neutral environment. Possibly. I mean, this is a possibility. We don't really have any firm science that goes one way or another on this yet. So Allah knows best. It's a possibility. Then if a normal child starts exhibiting gender confusion, what are the right steps to take? Well, you try to take the steps to reduce that gender confusion and deflate it as much as possible, right? And you should try to do so at immediately when you see it. Now, it doesn't mean you overreact to very small things, right? So you may have like a 3 or 4-year-old that spends time with his mother, and Salat time comes around and he throws a hijab on because he wants to be like his mom or something like that, right? That's not real gender confusion. That's just like a cute kid act or something like that, right? So we don't need to overreact sometimes over small things, but certainly if we see like really serious signs of gender confusion or gender confusion signs, those are steps where we need to intervene. And it might also be helpful for them, for the sort of gender-specific parent, to play a more prominent role. In fact, one of the theories of Joseph Nicolosi is that one of the contributors to gender dysphoria is a fracture between the parent-child relationship. And so a boy who doesn't really have a strong father figure that really has a good relationship with him, and you don't have that sort of paternal love and belonging and sense of manliness that can be cultivated in the boy. And so all he has is sort of the feminine expression of life, and vice versa, where a girl really has a fractured relationship with her mother and doesn't feel like femininity is the type of life that's for her. Sometimes childhood trauma can contribute to this quite heavily, especially really extreme forms of abuse, whether sexual abuse or otherwise. There's some studies on that as well. And Nicolosi tends to write about a lot of these things. And so there's a therapeutic approach that Joseph Nicolosi had written about, which is it's a good resource for people who want to read up on it, where he talks about reparative therapy. And that's the next question as well. What are some steps we can take to protect our children from this? I'd say let's just do the last. We'll do this as the last question. There are some steps we can take, which is simply reinforcing what I've said already here. About creating strong social spaces for our children, creating a strong household. We're really invested in the household in a loving way, where people are focused on the deen, on the religion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that we're worshiping together, we're being pious people, we're spending time in the masjid, we have families that share our values that we're spending time with, we're taking care with respect to their education and making sure they're being educated in proper spaces. I know some of the people have their kids in public school. I would say to the extent possible, Islamic schooling and homeschooling are preferable, especially today with the way that public schools are going. Those are certainly preferable options. And if those are viable in your situations, inshallah, they may be things worth considering. I'm not saying they're easy. I'm not saying that they don't come with their own challenges and problems. I'm simply saying given the gamut of problems and challenges that exist in public schools today, that those are options that are worth serious consideration. And again, we put our trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala after putting our best foot forward and making dua for our children, right? Like we cannot forget that we take the means, ittikhad al-asbab, and then we place our trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as we do every single day. And Allah knows best. So there are a lot more questions here. Fortunately, there's like 22 more questions. I think like 8 to 10 questions came in while I was going through the Q&A. Unfortunately, I'm not able to get to all of them. If people ever want to or have additional questions they'd like to get some answers to, they can always shoot me an email, mobeen.vaid@gmail.com. In addition to that, like I said, inshallah tomorrow at Muslim Matters Lookout, there should be an article that gets published, a very lengthy one, on the topic of transgenderism. And Allah knows best. So
Ustadh, you still have a couple more minutes. So I was reading through the questions. If it's okay with you, can I just say some of them that have like common themes behind them, and then you could
sure,
just
Bismillah, go ahead.
Yeah, so there was a couple questions on how you said in the psychiatrist community there's a change in how they view LGBT and these things as no longer like a mental illness. So there was quite a few questions on Muslim practitioners asking about this and how they should deal with it.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I mean, look, obviously anything that could be construed as conversion therapy probably carries licensing implications today, where people could lose their license. Having said that, I don't know that a lot of the approaches to conversion therapy have been especially effective or even helpful for people. I think reparative therapy approaches have proven to be helpful for people to varying degrees. And there's some Christian sites that have done a good job of this. There's one site called Brothers Road, I believe, and they have a program called Journey to Manhood, which is focused on boys who experience same-sex attraction and desires or feel gender dysphoria or gender anxieties about their sort of masculinity. So some people tend to speak very positively about them. I would say that people who are therapists and counselors and what we really need this and want to sort of build a profession that really focuses on these types of use cases should look into trying to establish practices that can exist outside of the prevailing licensing context, which is to say that, spaces where they're independently funded by the Muslim community and have greater latitude to instruct and guide children and adults in accordance with Islam, right? And not in accordance with the expectations of the profession, which may in fact be doing, and which often is doing, considerable harm to children and adults. And so this is not something that I would say by any extent, to any extent is easy, simply because of the implications. And transgenderism is going that direction, right? It's going that direction where someday, non-affirmative therapy could be very, very seriously stigmatized. Christians have adopted that sort of alternative model, and they have whole networks and institutions that are focused on therapy and mental health and all that type of stuff, which are explicitly Muslim, right? And run by Muslims and are institutionally funded by, Christian and funded by the Christian community. As Muslims, we have a couple of those. They're very small. I don't know how good or bad they are, so I can't really speak for them. I believe there's one in Jersey, one in Chicago. So there are a couple here and there. But I'd say that one of the areas in which Muslims really need to invest is in that, right? And being able to develop therapeutic approaches that reinforce our values and also integrate into the way in which people are treated a more holistic view of the human being, including spiritual therapy, helping people spiritually, come to a place of wholeness, right? Which I think is quite important, and Allah knows best. Any other questions?
Yeah, there was once again like quite a few on how to deal with this in schools, how like the language and how people act if you don't use the correct language in schools and in a workplace environment?
Yeah, I mean that's a tough question as well, right? I mean, look, if you're, I'd say the workplace is perhaps a bit more clear, although the school is as well, right? If you're at the workplace and you don't address someone who's transitioned by the right pronoun, that can carry HR implications, right? In school, you might get suspended or expelled or something like that, right? If that's the case. And so if you're dealing with that type of situation, then obviously you don't, like, there's no reason for you to come out, right? Because you don't want to lose your job, right? Nor do you want to lose your schooling. But we should keep in mind, even in those situations, the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, "Man ra'a minkum munkaran falyughayyirhu biyadihi," right? Whoever amongst you sees an evil, then he changes it with his hand. وَإِن لَمْ يَسْتَطِعْ فَبِلِسَانِهِ, and if he can't do that, then with his tongue. وَلَمْ يَسْتَطِعْ فَبِقَلْبِهِ, then at a minimum, you hate that action in your heart. You hate that action in your heart. And so the idea is that even in contexts where we can't necessarily speak out, right, we at a minimum monitor our hearts and make sure that our hearts never come to a place where they're indifferent to sin, where they are indifferent to sin and expressions of sin, but instead that we are always oriented towards Allah, and that we recognize that sin is something ugly and displeasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and a grave transgression. Okay, so at a minimum we do that, and then when we are in places and spaces where we can speak out, we don't hesitate to do so. We don't hesitate to do so. So the idea is that a person who, can just stay silent, try to stay away from that issue as much as they can, not contribute to whatever they have to do, right? But then, when they have the latitude to be forthright about it, they are, right? When they're not at the workplace, when they're not in school, right? But when they're amongst others, and if someone were to ask them about it, they say, look, this is morally wrong, right? They don't have to come out sort of viscerally, but they should be straightforward, honest, and correct about it. And this is what Allah asks for us, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best.
There were quite a few parents asking on what they should do if their children start coming up to them and saying that they don't identify as their gender or they're expressing confusion. What are some steps or things they can do on that?
Yeah, I mean, there's no playbook to this, right? I mean, these are all very recent issues. I myself have encountered families where one young child I dealt with, they were both boys. One I dealt with that was a boy, and I'm not like a therapist, just parents. I gave a lecture at one place, and the parents came up to me and the child there, and he had sort of a mild case, and he thought he was a girl, and I kind of looked at him. I said, look, there's nothing here that would indicate that at all. I said, mashallah, you're just like the rest of us, this and that. And a few weeks later, I sort of texted him. I said, how's everything going? He said, I don't even worry about that issue anymore. I'm fine. So alhamdulillah, he sort of detransitioned, if you will, and sort of desisted on his own very naturally, and it was okay. In other situations that I've run into, it can be quite severe, right? And so I'd say there are certain factors that a person should really try to have more attention around. Who are their friends? How much time are they spending on the internet? What sites are they going to, right? I would certainly cut those things off right at the root, right? So, maybe at some points, like, look, there can't be any internet usage right now because of how damaging a pipeline that is to you and a really large cadre of just shayateen, right? And really evil and wicked people who are now trying to tell you what to do, which is not good for your own health, right? Likewise, like I said, with friends. And like I said, right, this is perhaps an opportunity where one parent can really step in, try to build that bond, build that relationship, while at the same time reminding the child that they are like their actual sex, right? Like that's who you are, right? And that there's nothing wrong with them. There's nothing wrong with them, right? There's nothing wrong with how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made you. Allah fashioned you, فَأَحْسَنَ صُوَرِكُمْ, and He fashioned you in a perfect way, in a perfect way. And recognizing the blessing that Allah has given you in giving you your life, right, is something that we should be thankful to Allah for, and we should find fulfillment in, right? Because at the end of the day, right, a person's like just sort of cosmetically readjusting what you look like is never a path to fulfillment. It simply is not. In addition to obviously being displeasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Allah knows best. Any other questions? Are we good?
Yeah, I think those are like the main questions. If it's okay with you, is there like any way to contact you outside of here that they
Yeah,
could?
I said my name, which is listed here, mobeen.vaid@gmail.com. If people want to email me, they can, inshallah ta'ala. And you'll find it there, inshallah. Let me see here. Hold on. Let me post an article that I mentioned, or at least my blog site. I'll post that in the it's actually, I said it, it's medium.com/occasional reflections. You'll find some articles on gender and sex on that site, which hopefully can be helpful as well. Specifically, like I said, there's one on the perils of constructionism, of men, women, and the perils of constructionism. That's the name of it. There's a couple of them. There's one on gender diversifying our spaces. The perils of constructionism I would definitely start off with. There's another one that I have, which is on gender wars, #MeToo, and building a program of virtue and dignity. So there's that one as well. So I'd say at a minimum, if you're going to read two, I would do the on gender wars, and then the men, women, and perils of constructionism. Inshallah, hopefully those will be of some benefit. I think they're pretty accessible, easy reads, inshallah. So, Khair, are we good, Abdullah?
Yeah, I think we're good. Jazakallah khair, Ustadh Mobeen, for answering all those questions. I know it was quite a bit.
No, it's not a problem at all. It's sort of rapid fire, right? So,
Okay, inshallah, we'll take a 5-minute break. Inshallah, we'll take a 5-minute break and then we'll come back for the next session with Sheikh Tamim Ahmadi. So if everybody could regroup at 11:57, that would be perfect, inshallah.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Wa alaikum assalam.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. مولانا,
I think